Yesterday's right to peaceably assemble has given way to a declaration of civil emergency and mass arrests today.
Your conduct is in violation of state and city law, and your failure to leave the area now will subject you to arrest for failure to disperse.
The stance of the city and the state is vastly different, with State Patrol and National Guard backing up the Seattle police. Innocent bystanders walking along the sidewalk are getting tear gassed, and while the governor made assurances this morning things are back to normal, they're definitely not.
The state of emergency was just an hour old.
The state of emergency that they've been training for so long to deal with. Who was behind it? What caused it in Seattle in December of 1999? The World Trade Organization meeting. The riots, the supposed riots, and the military and police working together to keep the public safe from all that evil rabble. We're going to go in depth. This is a perfect textbook example of problem, reaction, solution. Training the public that the wheeled tanks keep us safe. But first, we have to examine the World Trade Organization, the WTO, to understand what happened in Seattle. The World Trade Organization was created in 1995 by the same institutions, the same powerful central banks that created the United Nations and empowered it in the late 1940s. They seek to destroy national sovereignty, not just in America, but worldwide, and rein it in under the control of a huge dictatorial machine. And their track record is clear. They are nothing more than servants of the corrupt global establishment, serving their every whim, dividing up the property on the global plantation. If one reads the different trade agreements that have been pushed by this World Trade Organization, energized in the last 5 years to world prominence, one realizes that it's nothing but a tool for consolidation. There's one catch. In recent years, the WTO, since its inception, has come across incredible opposition worldwide because of its obvious authoritarian implications. That's a hard thing to deal with when you've got highly motivated people that have real complaints and valid issues. How do you deal with it? Well, you simply call in your friends. The left coast communists posing as anarchists under Delta Force direction.
Broke windows at the Gap, they're smashing windows at McDonald's, they're dumping over garbage cans. And they are very angry again and hostile. We're seeing more clashes with other protesters telling them to stop because they're giving everyone a bad name. None of the protesters, the legitimate protesters down here, want any of this kind of action. And they are very angry.
So right now, knocking at the newspaper.
Megan, any sign yet of police trying to track them down?
No riot police anywhere. They're going like... They're breaking the bank window here at U.S. Bank. We got to get out of here. We're going to run up the street because if they see us, they attack us. And so we're keeping a safe distance away from them.
Several police officers have told us because they were assigned to control the protest crowds, they weren't allowed to break ranks and to stop the black bloc. So the group just continued destroying property for nearly an hour.
What's wrong with this picture? If the police are supposedly there to protect the public and property, then why? Why did state police, Seattle police, as well as the feds, stand back and allow the anarchists en masse to run around and throw bottles at police, cones, rocks, you name it, and assault private property as well as members of the general public? Because they needed someone to demonize the rest of the good demonstrators. Now, my friends, this is an old tactic throughout history. If you have opposition, you simply demonize them by creating your own crisis, your own massacre or terrorist bombing or incident, and then blaming it on your political opponents. When you have 50, 60,000 peaceful demonstrators out exposing the corruption, how do you neutralize them? Well, you simply send in your boys to create a crisis, to offer a solution. Now, we're not saying that local police knew what was going on. Certainly not. They just were following their orders, which is frightening in and of itself to let a bunch of anarchists, 30 or 40 of them tops, run around and burn and break things because they were ordered to do so. We're going to play you some little clips from newscasts and some amateur video Then we'll move into even more evidence that this was a government action. You see, the anarchists were actually given their own operations base, even during the curfew and civil emergency that was declared after their attacks. Boy, that was a good excuse to clear the streets. But first, watch just a small snippet of a local newscast that, of course, never went nationwide. Can't have the people finding out about what really happened. It's very revealing how the police just go along and allow this criminal activity. Then we'll get into who was behind it and how most of the anarchists are just useful idiots working for their provocateur bosses, and on into the state of emergency that was declared, and how not just Seattle but the nation was trained to accept armored personnel carriers and police in black uniforms, as well as National Guard being directed by the FBI and the Justice Department and Delta Force, is all part of living in a safe society to, well, you know, protect us from those dangerous anarchists.
The group we had seen all morning, a group we now know as anarchists called the Black Bloc, began terrorizing the city. I was live on the phone as it started.
Trying to break the windows. They're slamming against the window. Oh my gosh, they just broke the Starbucks window. They're breaking into it right now. I'm moving across the street.
It was a frightening moment, and I think I was in shock. I had been separated from my photographer, but as I followed this group, I soon met up with another Cairo photographer, Frank Simon, as the group's rage turned toward him. Photographer Eric Wald and I then followed the Black Bloc. There were about 30 of them, isolated by their black clothing, black hoods and masks. It was obvious as they continued their destruction that they were renegade protesters.
Yeah, take off the mask. Take off your mask and join the rest of us and shut up.
And now we're at the McDonald's at 3rd and Pine, where they are breaking more windows. They broke windows at the Gap. They're smashing windows at McDonald's. They're dumping over garbage cans. And they are very angry again and hostile. We're seeing more clashes with other protesters telling them to stop because they're giving everyone a bad name. None of the protesters, the legitimate protesters down here, want any of this kind of action. And they are very angry.
So right now, knocking on the newspaper.
Megan, any sign yet of police trying to track them down?
No riot police anywhere. They're breaking the bank window here at U.S. Bank. We got to get out of here. We're going to run up the street because if they see us, they attack us. And so we're keeping a safe distance away from them.
Several police officers have told us because they were assigned to control the protest crowds, they weren't allowed to break ranks and to stop the Black Bloc. So the group just continued destroying property for nearly an hour.
King 5's Deborah Feldman spoke to one police officer who says the department suffered from bad leadership. She's live tonight with this exclusive story. Deb?
Well, I spoke with a detective tonight who says he feels completely demoralized by the way police were treated last week. He says he's not just talking about the treatment they received from protesters, but also from some of their superiors. It's hard for most people to witness chaos and destruction, but Detective Donnie Lowe says as a police officer at the scene,
I was embarrassed.
Lowe and his fellow officers were under orders to hold their ground last Tuesday when protesters blocked access to the convention center. He says it was painful to watch the crowd harass delegates and not be able to help them. He wasn't even allowed to catch the crooks looting downtown businesses.
I watched this guy loot Nike Town, sit in the window of Nike Town. At some point in time, the employees of Nike Town were chased out, and they came running to us for assistance, and what we wasn't allowed to do anything.
Detective Lowe has, well, half the answer right. He's got half the picture in his hands. Certainly, it's horrible, it's inexcusable that city leaders under the control of the federal government in Seattle would instruct the police not to apprehend criminals while they were engaging in crimes publicly. Crimes like robbery, arson, and assault. That makes the police chief, the mayor, the Justice Department, the Delta Force, the FBI, you name them, running this operation guilty as accomplices. But in a second, Detective Lowe falls for the old trick we've been talking so much about. Problem, reaction, solution. He says, you know, we were attacked out there for a day. But, you know, later the city got it together and we went ahead and declared the emergency. Why? We had the no protest zone. Yeah, half the city. Why the civil emergency was needed. And we finally, you know, we got to get tough on them. Yeah, you got to get tough on all the peaceful demonstrators that were shutting down the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and now when people think of protesters across the country, especially city leaders, city managers and others say, boy, we better crack down, we better ban protest here too. And they're passing ordinances across the nation to implement emergencies whenever they feel like it. And the federal government is rubbing its hands together. All started by 30 to 40 anarchists running around, burning and beating and smashing and stealing. And the police, like dogs at the end of a chain, a Rottweiler you've been slapping, suddenly had their leashes released, and with wanton abandon, they rampaged out in a berserk fashion and attacked old ladies, store owners, you name it. And then they got to ship everybody to the FEMA center. That's right. FEMA was helping during this learning process for everyone. Wake up, police. Stop letting them manipulate you.
Even though the department has been criticized for the so-called no protest zones, Lowe defends them as necessary to regain control of the city.
I think our biggest problem here was leadership within this department refused to take appropriate actions when it was clearly necessary. And that's how it got out of hand.
You see, police, things were meant to get out of hand, to train the public to live in a continual state of emergency. Martial law is not some Hollywood pronouncement. It's an incremental slide towards more and more control. And on a scale of 1 to 10, on the police state Richter scale, we're at a 4 or a 5 right now in America.
While the labor march was large and peaceful, it was the unexpected violence that captured most of the media attention.
There's 3 issues of mischaracterization that have been sort of compounded by ignorance that I really think need to be addressed. Number 1, the civil emergency was created by the police. The police did nothing but stand there until there was enough property damage, and then suddenly there was a civil emergency. Now this occurred, and I have to add also that the emergency meeting of the City Council on Monday, I want to thank the 3 members who actually voted not to endorse the mayor's proclamation of civil emergency. But I find it very disappointing that there was no debate on the actual merits of the civil emergency. Everyone just said, oh, well, it's quite clear. Media reports say that the negotiators in front of the King County Jail want a real concession from the police by granting access to attorneys to the people who were being held in the prison. This is not something to negotiate. This is a right. And it took a court order. It took a court order to even get to that point. And I'd like to know what state the police and the jail system is in when this can happen to nonviolent protesters who are simply being held. And we were told beforehand that in meetings with the police that no one would be held at Sandpoint for more than half an hour. Now, I don't think that was realistic. In fact, that's such an Alice in Wonderland kind of thing to say that I don't really have a response to it.
I am very upset that my civil rights were suspended by Mayor Paul Schell so that WTO delegates could convene in our city. My freedom of movement was restricted, and I was subjected to harassment and arrest by the police. I was also subject to an excessive fine and 180 days in jail just for trying to protect myself from chemical poisoning by owning a gas mask. This private property was subject to confiscation by the police. A no-protest zone was created which made it impossible for citizens to peaceably assemble and exercise free speech. I do not appreciate being gassed when I'm trying to get home from work or when I'm trying to shop downtown. I was nowhere near any of the demonstrations. Both times I was tear gassed. I suffered headaches and sinus pain for days afterwards, and I was forced to seek a physician's care. I also witnessed clouds of tear gas wafting out over the reservoir on Capitol Hill where our drinking water comes from. I would like the City Council to look into the effects of chemical poisoning of our water. Just because a small group of vandals caused property damage downtown on one night, it does not give the city government or Governor Locke the right to deny my personal liberties and to gas law-abiding citizens. Every time there is a Super Bowl victory party, a World Soccer Championship, or Halloween in Detroit, much more property damage results. This has nothing to do with politics. Nonviolent civil disobedience is a very American tradition. Martin Luther King Jr., Henry David Thoreau, Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks. Without public protest, we would still have slavery, and even white women would not have the right to vote. I would want the city council to look into the federal government's role in these events as well. These protesters were held at a FEMA installation at Sandpoint, and I'd like to know what happened to the foreign nationals who were arrested, and are they in trouble with the INS? Thank you.
There were people who were willing to get arrested because they knew what they were intending to do might be illegal. They might intend to block an area. But instead of arresting those people, an entire community was assaulted with chemical substances.
Those here claim riot police attacked people on the street indiscriminately. Whether they were a protester or a resident living nearby, it didn't matter. Riot police attacked people on the street indiscriminately. Riot police attacked people on the street indiscriminately. Indiscriminately.
The medical bills are going to be enormous for me.
I attempted to get help. The gentleman who said that there were people guarding the windows. There were peaceful demonstrators guarding the windows. There were also those of us who broke off from them, attempted to get a police officer. Mind you, the police officers who were standing a dozen-fold behind seated demonstrators with their arms linked, who quite obviously were not going anywhere, and I don't believe weighed over 100 pounds, any of them. I could not get one of them to break away to help me stop the violence that was going on. I want some answers. I definitely want some answers. I am very, very angry in that regard. But I think they ought to be reminded they are public servants.
Right. We're about to get to hardcore evidence proving that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, that secret government system, was actually running the show. But first, even more evidence that the city was aiding and abetting the criminal anarchist.
We've all witnessed the confrontations over the past few days. At times, it's hard to tell whether police are protecting citizens or threatening them. When two apparent Good Samaritans stop to help a fallen woman, they all get pepper sprayed. Even media members weren't spared.
If you thought the anarchists who commandeered a privately owned downtown building were out of town now, well, think again. As Cairo 7 Eyewitness News reporter Christina McKenna has found out, they're still here and still living rent-free.
Susan, when these anarchists moved out of the building behind me on Saturday, a lot of people thought they should have been headed to jail. Instead, it turns out a lot of them just headed around the corner, and they're now living in a building right over here where they're enjoying electricity, hot water, and heat, all rent-free.
Saturday afternoon was a celebration here. 7 days after they commandeered this downtown building, anarchists walked away without a word from police.
It feels to me like we won.
And at least some are still winning. As part of the deal to get them to surrender this building, anarchists were offered housing just around the corner at the same price. The building is owned by the Low Income Housing Institute, a private nonprofit that is in large part funded by the city and is now working with the city to house the anarchists.
First of all, with criminal trespassing, that was me or you or the average person out in the street, we'd be in jail.
John Satoli can't believe the anarchists aren't in jail now. As a lawful tenant in the building the anarchists had seized, he was locked out of his packaging and shipping business for a week during his busiest season. Satoli can't believe he's now contemplating bankruptcy, and the people who put them there have paid no consequence at all.
They walked away. They walked away, and the city of Seattle, low-income housing, moved them across the street on me and yours taxpayers' dollars.
So why didn't the police department arrest the anarchists when they moved out of that building? Well, that's a question a lot of people are asking, especially since the West Precinct is just down the block. We asked the police department this weekend. We asked them again today. They still haven't returned our call with an answer.
The riotous behavior I saw was by the Seattle Police Department, the Washington State Patrol, and the Federal Bureau of Investigations.
From the city's standpoint, we had security.
And at least 20 agencies were involved. We had the lead, but clearly the Secret Service, the FBI, all of the state and local agencies dealing with security, the Port of Seattle, ATF, and a lot of work from traveling to Geneva to looking at the NATO conference in Washington, D.C., trying to do the best they could to understand what both the threat was and then how to plan to do it.
It just makes me furious.
Building owner Wal Louis says he wanted police to arrest the demonstrators who occupied his 3-story building at the start of WTO meetings. He says they left a mess.
We're just cleaning up the mess right now. There's some human waste up there that we haven't removed and nobody wants to touch it. We'll try to find an outfit to do that.
Instead of eviction, police asked housing activists to negotiate with demonstrators. Sharon Lee of the Low Income Housing Institute convinced the protesters to voluntarily leave the building, in part by offering them temporary housing in a private nonprofit shelter around the corner.
I think we avoided a major confrontation.
This is a failure of leadership.
No, my friends, it's not a failure of leadership. From the start to the finish and even after, the anarchists were housed. They were protected. They were not to be arrested by Seattle police. It's a staged, managed operation. And since Seattle, these same anarchists have been used in Washington, D.C. to create a state of emergency. For a day, they allow them to spray paint pig on police cars and attack officers. And then the police are released once they're at fever pitch. They are useful tools to neutralize the general population's ability to engage in political protest. After the anarchists had put on their display for the news cameras, the authorities had all they needed to rationalize a total suspension of civil as well as human rights. Publicly, in front of everyone's eyes, they started declaring that people couldn't have banners or posters or even stickers or buttons on their clothes against the WTO. Anyone who got in their way was arrested and shipped to a FEMA center, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. In direct violation of Posse Comitatus, had Delta Force on the ground from day one of the demonstrations and protest, continually integrating the local, state, county, and city police under federal command. This should be a giant red flag for any American concerned about their God-given rights and their freedom in this